In this video, we're going to continue to talk about JavaScript modules, as there are a few other ways we can use both the export and the import to better structure and set up our files. The first thing I'd like to talk about are the two different styles of exports available to us, because currently we're only using one of the two styles. So right here, I'm going to remove the console.log statement, which isn't needed anymore, and I will set up a little bit of documentation to talk about these two styles. First up, we have the named export. This is what we're currently using. And the other style is the default export. Now, a named export is exported like we've seen already. It has a specific name assigned to it, and when we want to import it, I have to import it by that name. So over here, I have add and name exactly as they appear in the export. These are named exports, and we can have as many of these as we need. I could have one if I just need one. I could have 40 if I happen to need 40. The other type of export made available to you is the default export. All of our files can choose to have one default export should they want to. So with named exports, we can have as many as we need. With default exports, we can only have at most one because it's the default, so there could only be one. Down below, we're going to go ahead and set up another function to be our default export. So let's go ahead and create this const square equals. We can just create a function that squares a number. So I'm going to multiply x by x and return that value, where x is the one and only argument our little function accepts. Now, to set up a default export, we actually have to go on the next line and add the following. Export default followed by the thing we are trying to export. In this case, it is square defined just above. And there we go. We now have one default export set up for utilities, and we can only have one. Obviously, with named exports and default exports, we can choose to have 0 if we don't need any. Here we have two named exports, and we have one default. Now that we have this default one in place, let's go ahead and see how we can actually grab that from index.js and make use of it. That's going to happen by making a change to line 1. Now, the change we're going to make is going to look a bit different than anything we've done so far with import. To grab the default export, we actually don't put anything inside of curly braces. Instead, we put something just before the curly braces. So right here, we're going to go ahead and grab the default. I'm going to grab square, setting up a comma and a space. Now, with the default export, we can actually call it anything we like, because remember, we're not grabbing it by its name like we're grabbing add and name by their names. We're grabbing it by the fact that it is the default. So I could call this something like other square, and that would work just as well. In either case, I'm not grabbing it by its name, I'm grabbing it by the fact that it is the default. Now, if I didn't need any named exports and I just wanted the default export, my import statement would look a bit like this. So in this case, I am just grabbing the default export from the utilities file. I'm no longer grabbing add, and I'm no longer grabbing name. I'm going to undo that change though, so we do grab all three. Then down below, we're actually going to use other square to prove that things are working. I'm going to use console.log to print something to the console. Then I will call the other square function, and I'm going to pass in some number. Let's go ahead and pass in 10. 10 times 10 being 100. I'm going to save index.js. Over inside of the terminal, I'm going to rerun Webpack. This is going to rerun the file, setting up the new default export and using it. And right here, what do I get? I get 100 printing to the console successfully. So in this case, we were able to export something as the default export. Then we were able to import it and actually make use of it. Now, there's no hard and fast rule for when to use a named export and when to use the default export, so I'll give you a quick guiding principle. If I find myself with one big thing that a file is trying to export, like a class or a function, I'll typically use the default export for that. If I find myself needing to export 5 or 6 different functions or classes, then I'll usually use named exports for all of those. But remember, this is just a guiding principle that I happen to follow. There is no wrong way to set these up. The only real rule is that you can have at most one default export, and you can have as many named exports as you need. And as we've seen, you can use a combination of both when exporting and both when importing. All right, the last thing I want to talk about is a different way we can set up our exports. Currently, we're setting up all of our exports as we define things in the file. There's also an alternative syntax that allows us to define all of the exports in one place, typically the last line in the file. So let's go ahead and look at that. And to kick things off, we're going to remove all exports up above. So we're going to end up with just a regular file that defines 3 variables: add, name, and square. The goal is to set up the exports so the import statement works as is. That means I still want square to be the default export, and I still want name and add to be named exports. The alternative syntax still starts off with export, but then we set up an opening and closing curly brace. Everything else we define on this line goes right inside. In here, for named exports, all we have to do is reference them. So for add and name, I just reference them exactly as they're defined above. For add, I can set it up like this. If I wanted to add on another one, which I do, I would just use a comma and a space and define that as well. Now this file is setting up 2 named exports, add and name. Configuring the default export is very similar. We just need to add another item inside of here. It doesn't have to be the last item. In this case, it just is. We reference the thing we're trying to set up as the default export. In this case, it's square. Then we use as default afterwards. We could use as default with anything inside of here, but we can only use it with one. In this case, we're using it with square, so I couldn't use it with name or add. But I could switch it up if I wanted to change what I'm exporting as the default export. Now with this line in place, we have the exact same functionality we had before. I can save the utilities file and prove this by running the program without making any changes to the import statement over here. We're going to leave that as is. In the background, I am going to rerun Webpack. It's going to regenerate the bundle. The browser refreshes, and what do we get? We get the exact same output, which is great. It's still able to find the add and square functions, and it's still able to get the name and print it to the console. So there we have it. You now know pretty much everything there is to know about using JavaScript modules. Now don't worry, we're going to get some more real-world experience later in this section when we actually integrate all of this into the applications we've built so far. So I'm not going to leave you hanging there. But before we go, I do want you to use what we've learned here with the file created in the last video. Down below, this is an easy one, and I do have 2 steps for you to get this done. The first thing you're going to do is change Scream in this file over to a default export, and I'd like you to use the technique covered down here in utilities.js. Then as step 2, all you need to do is switch up the import statement in index.js to correctly grab the default export, since currently it's grabbing the named export, which is going to go away. In the end of the day, the program should still work as expected. I should still be able to scream the name to the console. So take some time to knock this out. Pause the video, test your work, and when you're done, click play. How'd that one go? Let's go ahead and kick things off by setting it up as the default export. So I'm going to remove export in front of my variable declaration. Then down below, I'm going to add that line, exporting some stuff inside of curly braces. In this case, there's just one thing I want to export, and it is Scream. Now, if I were to leave the code like this, I would be exporting Scream as a named export. That's not what I want. I want it as a default export. So right here as default. Perfect. And now that we have this in place, we can actually move on to step 2 and change the import statement. Over inside of index.js, we currently have it as a default import. We just need to switch up line 2 right here. We're no longer grabbing any of the named exports. Instead, we're trying to grab the default one. Now I could call this Scream. That would work perfectly fine with the code, but just to drive the point home that we can call it whatever we want, I'm going to call it other Scream. Then down below, I'm just going to change the function we use from Scream to other Scream. Now if we save index.js, we can go ahead and actually test our work. I'm going to rerun things from the terminal, rerunning Webpack for the final time in this video. Down below, we can see our program still runs correctly, printing Andrew in all uppercase with our exclamation mark on the end. So there we have it. We now know how to use the JavaScript module system, and we're going to take advantage of that throughout the rest of the course. That's it for this one. I'll see you in the next one.